This tutorial is going to be a bit unusual. We won't discuss another simple way to knit or another interesting knitting technique. No. Instead, I'll show you how to make mistakes. Why? Because when we know how to make mistakes, we better understand how to avoid them. So let's take a look at 5 ways how we can accidentally make unwanted holes in our knitting. The first mistake is very common for beginner knitters. It happens at the beginning of the row when we accidentally pull the yarn over the needle like this. And then what happens? We see 2 legs of the same stitch and we kind of assume that that's 2 stitches. So that's how we treat them. We simply knit each leg of the same stitch as a stitch. And that increases the number of stitches, and that also creates a little hole right here on the edge. But you know what? The hole in this case is the smallest issue. As you see here, you can see where the holes are, but that's not what really is that big of a problem, because the biggest issue is that the fabric becomes slanting outwards. And unfortunately, the only fix for that would be to unravel everything up to the point where the mistake happened, undo the mistake, and then redo the work again. And this way, your edges would be all straight and nice, because there are no other ways to fix a mistake like this. The second mistake usually happens in the middle of the row. And usually it happens in stitch patterns that have purls and knits in the same row. Mine is just plain stockinette stitch, but I will pretend as if I have purls there as well. So what usually happens? You would bring the yarn to the front of the work as if you were purling a stitch, but then at some point you realize that this is a knit stitch, and then you start knitting it with the yarn at the front of the work, and that creates a yarn over, a plain simple yarn over, which also adds a new stitch to your work, and it also creates a hole. And the hole is much bigger, so it's a nice round lovely hole just at the middle of the work. That is quite noticeable on any stitch pattern. You will definitely see it. Besides the extra stitch, if you're working in a stitch pattern with a pattern repeat, this extra stitch will completely ruin the look of the stitch pattern, because it will shift it and you will notice that something is not right. And then when you see this hole, you will realize that that's an accidental yarn over. That's the name of this mistake. So this mistake is so common that it got its own name. The way to fix it would be to unravel the yarn over. If you notice it in the next row, so I'm going to show you how it looks. Let's say I am knitting and knitting and knitting, and then when I come to the next row, and I'm purling in my case because that's stockinette stitch, then when you come to the yarn over, you will notice that something is not right, unless you're really distracted and then you kind of miss it and you keep working. But otherwise you will notice, okay, that's a yarn over. When this happens and you are sure that this is not the yarn over that is required by your pattern, simply let it go, just like this, and then continue working. This will loosen up the stitches a bit, but not by much. If it's just one yarn over, it's not going to be a big deal. And you can always redistribute the yarn when later on, when you pull the swatch like this, when you have a bit more body on it, and then pull it along the direction of the knitting. Basically, you can do the same thing later on, even if you notice that yarn over later, a few rows later, you can do the same thing. You can just drop it and unravel everything, but I personally prefer to unravel the whole piece, because what happens, a few of those unraveled yarn overs will loosen the whole fabric, so you will definitely see an area where the stitches are looser than elsewhere, and that's not gonna look nice. So it's always easier to unravel a few rows and then undo that yarn over and continue working in your pattern. The third mistake I'm going to show you today is very similar to the previous one. It's also kind of an accidental yarn over, but it happens in a different way. What happens is, when you knit a stitch, you insert the needle into the stitch like you normally do, then you wrap the needle with the yarn, but you don't pull the wrap through. Instead, you simply slip the stitch with the wrap to the right needle. Let's do it again. So you go, basically I'll knit one stitch and then I'll show you again. You go into the stitch, you wrap it, and then you slip it off without knitting it. So that, again, if you are distracted, that happens easily, especially if you're not really experienced. But this mistake has an easy fix if you notice it in the next row. So in the next row, when you come to that mistake, you will see that something is not right. See? So what you should do, you should simply pick the stitch that was not really knit and pull it over the yarn over and let it go. This way you are finishing the process of creating the stitch. So you're finishing off what you started but haven't finished in the previous row. Let's do it again. So you see, okay, something is not right. So what you do, you pick this stitch, the one that is not knit. You go in there, pick it, and then pass it over this wrap and let it go. And this way you fix this problem. But if you notice it later on, that's gonna be more difficult to fix, and I'll show you how it's gonna look. It will be a hole, just like this one. It will be an extra stitch that comes from that hole, because you would treat the wrap as a stitch and you would treat the stitch as a stitch. So you basically added another stitch in that spot. And if you're working in a pattern that has a pattern repeat, that will completely offset the pattern. So you will see the problem here. And when that happens, the best way to fix it would be to go back, to unravel the work and undo that mistake, and then continue working in the pattern. The next mistake is also a very common one. Like all mistakes, it happens when we are not paying attention. So what happens, we may accidentally, instead of going inside the stitch, we may accidentally go under the strand between stitches and knit it like this, and then keep going with your pattern without paying attention, obviously, because otherwise you would notice. This mistake creates a really small hole. I'll show you how it looks, just like this one. See, it's smaller than the hole created by an accidental yarn over. See, this one is bigger. And that's why you might not even notice it, especially if you are working in a loose pattern. You might not even pay attention, but there is an extra stitch. And as is true with the previous ways, with the previous mistakes, you will notice that the pattern is off if you're working in a pattern with a stitch pattern repeat. The remedy for this mistake, the way to fix it, would be about the same as with all accidental yarn overs. So you will basically undo the yarn over, go back. That will loosen the fabric. So I would stay away from that way, really. I would rather unravel it all the way to the mistake, undo it, especially if you're working in a stitch pattern with a pattern repeat, because you can unravel the hole, or even if you stitch the hole, you cannot fix the damage done to the pattern repeat. So it's always better to go back, even if it's a piece of your work, still go back and unravel it rather than trying to kind of patch it, because later on you won't feel happy about it, and then it might be too late to fix anything because the project will be finished. So don't do that. Unravel it and then start over. Another way to make an unwanted hole would be to turn your work in the middle of the row and start working on the same stitches again. Why would you do that? There are two reasons. The first reason is when you stop knitting before you finish a row for some reason. you just drop your work and then you take it again, and then you are not sure where you stopped, and then you turn your work accidentally and start working on the same stitches, and as you see, that creates a huge hole. Another reason could be short rows. If you're working short rows and then you just come to the point where you have to turn your work, you forget to anchor the yarn in the next stitch. So normally in the short rows you would wrap the yarn around the next stitch and then you would turn your work. But if you forget to do that, that would be a hole, and I'll show you how it looks. I made 2 of those mistakes in this swatch to show that the holes are pretty big. Another thing that happens, because you add 2 extra rows every time you make this mistake, the shaping changes. As you see, it becomes curvy, and there is no way to fix it. You have to unravel. So that's the sad truth, that you cannot fix it. You have to unravel your work and pick up again all the stitches and start working on and on. Well, now that you know how to make those mistakes, you will do your best to stay away from them, right? Especially when you realize that, unfortunately, in most cases, you will have to unravel part of your work to fix them. For some of my tips on how to avoid these little issues, follow the link in the description. Thank you for watching this video and have a wonderful week. I'll see you next Thursday.